Sucking on my titties like you wanna be calling. Check out my Chrissy behind it's fine all of the time. Like sex on the beaches. Whatever's in the teachers of peaches.
We just listen to the whole song.
Oh.
You go to know.
Sucking on my titties.
Just kidding.
Hi. Hi. That was our intro today.
We're here.
We've arrived. We know we're live now, so we've gotten better at least one part of this. So I am, as usual, really excited to talk about suicide and stuff. And tonight we are going to talk about the carceral system and incarceration and suicide, which is, I think, a really important topic that doesn't get discussed a ton, or when it does, there's, I think, a lot of sort of like generalizations and assumptions that people make about what that looks like and all of that. So I'm really excited to be able to talk about it. But also, do we do intros first or we talk about our rating first? I can't remember the order.
Whatever you want.
Let's do our rating.
Okay.
Let's do our rating since we opened with peaches. I feel like people already know. But we are rated R for language, terror, and some disturbing images. If you're under 17, you should be accompanied by an adult or a guardian. I don't really know about that. You can watch it if you're under 17, but if you want to ask your mom, you can, or your dad, or whoever is responsible for what you consume. So my name is Jess Stohlmann-Rainey, and I work at Rocky Mountain Crisis Partners. People on this show will laugh at me, whether I'm funny or not, I think, which is great because I try and make jokes. We are a organization in Colorado that serves the state with our crisis and peer support lines. And then I do quite a bit of work in the suicide prevention, suicidology field, really looking at lived experience and social justice and how those things intersect with suicide and suicide research. So that's me. Des, do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Dese'Rae Stage. I run a series of portraits and true stories of suicide attempt survivors called Live Through This. I've interviewed almost 200 attempt survivors across the United States, and you can look at those stories and those portraits at livethroughthis.org, spell it all out. I do other stuff too, but I'm really tired and I don't want to talk about it.
And then we have a guest. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm Frances Abderhalden. I work currently at University of Central Florida and at Cal State LA, but I will be a tenure track faculty member at Cal State LA come August. And my primary research is on suicidality within jail populations. So that's what my dissertation was on. That's where my continued research is headed. And so that's kind of me in a nutshell.
The tiniest nutshell.
Nutshell, like a pistachio.
Ooh, pistachios are good. They're my favorites.
They're really good.
Yeah. So let's just start off by talking about what kinds of things are drawing you to doing work in suicidology, suicide prevention, however you think about the work.
Yeah, so I kind of think that I cross over a lot of those categories. But what got me originally started is I'm a person with lived experience. And so it's something that I'm not kind of shying away from with my work. But I was in criminal justice for my master's and I loved it. And I knew I wanted to work with people who are incarcerated. But I didn't know exactly where I fit into that because a lot of the things that I'm interested in are a little bit more related to the emotionality aspect of human behavior as opposed to why crime or, I'm not as concerned with why people are committing crime. I mean, I am, but not as much. So I really care about experiences and emotionality. And so that led me down a path of looking at things like hopelessness, which eventually brought me to the point of saying, why am I not looking at suicide? No one is really looking at suicide, especially within jail populations. So there is a lot of literature within the prison system with suicide, primarily with completed suicides or people who die by suicide. but there's pretty much nothing within the jail literature, which is our largest proportion of our incarcerated population goes through jail. So I said, I'm going to just start looking at it and start digging into this. And luckily I was able to kind of navigate my way to collecting some data on it. But that's really where I started. And I think a lot of what has shaped some of the questions that I ask people on my surveys has come from my own lived experience, which I think has been endlessly beneficial to me, because things that people wouldn't have expected to ask in prior literature, like emotional questions or like childhood trauma questions, which are just starting to appear kind of in the criminal justice field for questioning. Those were all things that I knew had huge relevance to my own suicidal experience. And so I wanted to be sure to bring those in. That seemed very long-winded.
No, that was great.
Okay.
So I think a lot of people are just thinking about and talking about incarceration right now in ways that it doesn't usually get much of a spotlight. So I'm really excited about the timing, because we've rescheduled with you more than once. And,
Oh my God.
we were just waiting for the right time.
Was the day I defended my dissertation. I don't know, like,
You're a doctor.
what we were thinking how it was going to end up working out, but here we are.
So
ladies.
yeah,
Ambitious people.
yeah. So I am interested in just kind of starting to think about what the connections are between incarceration and suicide, and some of the things that you've learned in your experience.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that initially surprised me the most is that suicide occurs in the jail population 8 times more than it does in the general public. So obviously that's not quantity of numbers wise, but it's percentage and proportion of that population is 8 times more at risk for suicidal behaviors and for dying by suicide than the general population, which is just, when you start to really break that down, it's like an asinine number, right? It becomes, we already know like suicide is massive in the general public, and now we're saying it's 8 times greater of a risk factor for someone who's incarcerated in jail. And when we're talking about jail, for those who aren't, just to give like a brief little definition for those who aren't super familiar, there is a difference between jail and prison. Jails are more short-term housing facilities. They're typically people who are either pre-sentencing, pre-conviction, or if they have a conviction, it's for a relatively low-level crime because they are shorter term, whereas prison is typically a longer-term sentence, and that's post-conviction. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot of things that happen in jail as far as being more volatile, people of all different types of offenses being housed together. All of these things kind of play into how suicidality occurs within those incarcerated places or facilities.
And then, so I'm not sure if the data that I saw was about Colorado specifically, or if it was more general, but are most of the highest suicide death rates in that population all pre-trial?
Yes. So the majority of them are pre-trial. And so what we know is that there's a lot of people who are first-time offenders who are going to jail, and that alone is enough of a risk factor to lead to not necessarily completed suicides, but suicidality, so suicidal behaviors and that can range, it depends on state how they classify it, but it can range anything from, self-harming, self-mutilation to very serious, all the way through attempting. So any of those kind of, which is one big issue with how it's studied within jail environments, is that it's all kind of lumped into one as opposed to being broken out. And Colorado is actually one of the few states that does a great job at reporting. A lot of states kind of brush it under the rug and don't really report true accounts unless they have to because someone has died. So there's a lot of underreporting. So even though we say 8 times more likely, it's just an estimate, really.
Yeah. So this might not be on your list of things to talk about, but I'm interested in how, in relationship to this, what would change? What do you think might change around suicide if we didn't have a cash bail system and those pretrial folks weren't there?
I am so glad you're asking this.
Hey.
So I don't have a great answer right now, but I did collect data on people who have been awarded bail and then not awarded bail or given the opportunity. And it's something that I'm planning to kind of write up, hopefully, well, I say in the near future, but who knows, maybe 6-7 months from now. But I think future. Just from what was that?
That's totally the near
I know.
Is it? Okay.
I would 6 months will go so fast.
Yeah.
Well, I collected this data in October of last year, so it feels like I've been sitting on it, but I haven't. I've just had other stuff going on. Anyway, so I think that so I don't know of any study that has specifically looked at it, but I do think that there's a huge correlation, which is why I added a bunch of questions about it. And just logically thinking through, even we see there's disproportionate rates of Black individuals who are incarcerated who commit suicide. There's disproportionate rates of LGBTQ+, which is also a question I have on my surveys, which hasn't really been studied as far as people incarcerated. We tend to shy away from asking these questions because we want people to answer our studies, but there's really no reason to shy away from it because it's just another question on a study for, it's anonymous. There's no way to link it back. And I've had a great response, just written response for including questions like that, which is awesome. But I think just logically speaking, bail has to have a play in it, right? It has to have some sort of play that individuals so people who are at risk for committing suicide or dying by suicide, I'm trying to get away from saying committing suicide. I'm sorry. I'm working on it.
It's a big shift in language for people.
Yeah. I am aware of it though. So at least that's a start.
Yeah.
But so a lot of the people who are these higher risk individuals who are coming in their first time incarcerated, typically speaking, they're people that maybe would not be awarded bail, cash bail, because they're from maybe a lower socioeconomic status. We know that bail is completely, I can say fuck on here, right?
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
We're rated R.
Language, terror.
Yeah.
So how
disturbing
bail
images.
Yeah, it's just so fucked, right? The wealthy there you go. Wealthy individuals are more likely to be awarded bail, people who come from upper middle class. And those aren't typically the people that were that concerned or that aren't as high of a risk for suicidality when they're incarcerated. And so if we were able to award cash bail, or in my opinion, no bail, I think we should R&R a lot of people that we don't release on their own recognizance so that they don't have to pay anything. I think there's a ton more people that should be released that way. It would be, in my opinion, again, I haven't analyzed the data yet, but it would be hugely significant in reducing some of the suicidality we see, especially in jails, because again, they're short term, a lot of first time offenders. I mean, it's crazy some of the offenses that people are spending time in jail for, which is a whole thing I could rant on for a long time.
Yeah, I think one of the things, as I've been doing a lot more donations to bail funds in Colorado recently, I have noticed some of the people that are getting bailed out sometimes had a bail amount of $300, but they had been in jail for several months. And so that's a really long time for just a $300. That doesn't make sense that our system is set up that way. So it's I think it's pretty harmful for people.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I see Roberto Gonzalez in the chat talking about Khalif Browder. I think that's how you say his name. That's a case, in my opinion, where yes, he died by suicide after he was released. But so much of that, and this is something that I've really been working on, is talking about transitional care. So even though he died by suicide after he was released from jail, it's pretty clear and pretty evident that jail was a huge factor into why that played out the way that it did. And I think that having some more transitional care and support would be greatly beneficial. I know this is something that I'll probably touch on a little bit more later too, but transitional care is just not given, especially for mental health and especially for people who are reporting having any sort of suicidality or suicidal behaviors. It's like once we release them, we just say, good luck to ya, pat you on the back. You know, like it's not even really a pat on the back. It's like a kick in the rear. So it's like, it's crazy. And I think that could have been, I hate to say that. I don't really hate to say it. I think it could have been prevented. Like, I think it easily could have been prevented if we had offered better options and transitional care and cared about this kid. He was literally a kid to, reintegrate back into society after he'd been held for 3 years, I think it was. I could be wrong on that, but I think it was like 3 years. Yeah.
So can we talk about, we've kind of jumped around, which is, I think, going to happen a ton, because anytime we have topics we know a ton about, it's easy to jump down some holes. So I want to make sure we go back to all the things so that we can close some loops, because I feel like there's so much good stuff to talk about. What happens if someone is inside a carceral system and they are experiencing a suicide crisis? What happens in that system?
So it does vary a little bit based on facility and what protocol they have. So there is no standard of care. That's one huge thing. There is no standard of treatment. There's no standard of care across different jails and even different prison systems. It's really kind of just a free-for-all. But typically what would happen if someone reports that they have suicidal behaviors or that they're, ideating or something like that, they're going to be, instead of being taken to, say, some therapy or some treatment that's a little bit more, I don't mean hands-on in the sense that it's like literally hands-on, but something a little bit more nurturing, I guess, is what I would say. Maybe, I don't know. That's
potentially, yeah.
That's the word that came to mind.
Probably more nurturing than what you're going to say next.
So what typically happens, to most people's not surprise, is that they get thrown into what we literally call a suicide cell. And so it's a solitary confinement cell, typically padded, with everything stripped away, which is kind of weird to say because solitary confinement cells are stripped away anyway. But what I mean is that any potential ability to self-harm or to die by suicide is removed. And it depends on the seriousness and the risk level of the individual, but they're either on 24-hour watch or sometimes it's a little bit less watch than that. But what a lot of people don't realize is that 24-hour watch doesn't literally mean that there's like a CO sitting, or sorry, a correctional officer CO sitting right outside the cell watching you 24/7. It means that it can be either a human individual watching you or it can be by CCTV. And the majority of suicide watch cells are watched by CCTV simply for a manpower reason. So someone can sit in a booth and watch, a bunch of different monitors with people in them at the same time, which is just hugely problematic in so many ways. Suicide cells on their own are hugely problematic. But that's typically how individuals are treated. I say that very loosely because I wouldn't call that treatment, are treated when they're incarcerated.
And so, like, given what we know about solitary confinement, how often do people start to feel better or different while they're in those cells? Like, how long do people stay in that kind of cell?
So there are some restrictions that people can't stay for. It depends. Again, it varies. Typically, it's like between 72 and 96 hours is how long people will usually be held before they're released back in, and then they're just kind of monitored a little bit heavier. But what's like one of the largest predictors or risk factors for suicidality of people incarcerated is solitary confinement. Like, so we're taking people who are saying that they're having mental struggles and that they're going through something and they're asking for help because people are self-identifying, right? They're saying, I'm feeling this way. I want to hurt myself. And we're saying, okay, great, we're going to put you in a place that we know is going to only increase your risk for that.
Cool. So really, really using great interventions to really help our incarcerated neighbors. Yeah.
We're putting them by themselves with very little interaction, very little treatments, giving a lot of people time to think about like, okay, when I'm out of here, now what am I going to do? And unfortunately, what a lot of people end up doing is dying by suicide once they're released. It's a horrible cycle of like, it seems so obvious that this doesn't work. And yet there's very few policies and a lot of it's a funding issue, but there's very few policies that are changing how this works. And suicide is so expensive to facilities. And treatment, like proper treatment and proper prevention would be such a better cost-effective measure than how expensive it is for a facility to deal with someone who dies by suicide.
Yeah. So it's not like saving them money. It's not saving people's lives.
No,
it's not. No, sounds like nobody's really benefiting in this situation. So why do you think we're doing this?
I think a lot of it is a lack of education and a lack of awareness as to, I think that people who identify as having suicidality within facilities are deemed in some way as weak or as other, like they're put into this other category. And unfortunately, because we don't have a ton of, say, social workers in facilities or therapists and things like that, like the way to handle it is by taking these very undertrained, very undereducated correctional officers and saying, what can we do to treat people? And there's just this huge disconnect in what actually could be done. And a lot of it would take some big reallocation of funding and how they're handling, providing services to people. But this is really not just a correctional health issue, in my opinion, like not just my opinion, like this is well in kind of the field and the realm is any correctional health, especially in jail situations, really is public health. It's a public health issue. It's not just a correctional health issue because all of these people who are in jails, because again, it's shorter term, low level offenses, they're going to come back into our communities. They're coming back to our neighborhoods. They're here with all of us. And so it should matter how we're treating and taking care of them because it impacts everyone when they, return.
Right. And I think it's cool to care about people, whether they've been accused of crimes or not. Right. That would be a cool standard. But then outside of that, let's say that's not your standard of thinking about it. It also has this implication for when people reintegrate.
For sure. And I also think we can't care as suicidologists, which is one thing that drives me insane. We can't care about preventing suicide if we don't care about preventing all suicide. So that means and includes people who are incarcerated. That includes the Jeffrey Epsteins of the world. Should he probably have been in jail for all his crimes? I don't want to get too far into this because the rabbit hole don't need to go down. But we need to care about suicide for everyone.
Right. Yeah.
So I see Roger asking a couple of quick questions that I can answer not easily, but quickly.
Right. Do it.
So to maneuver IRB has been definitely difficult. The first survey that I did, the way I got around it was I had a 13-page survey and my self-harm and suicidality questions were kind of mixed into it. But they were not the only things on the survey. So I had a lot of questions about adjustment to the jail facility, reentry concerns, things like that, a bunch of other studies that will go out of this survey. And so a lot of the assessing suicide in jail questions got passed because of that. But I also had the psychologist at the jail look over my survey before I submitted it to IRB and made sure that he had seen it and also had given permission that he would do any sort of debriefing care to anyone who took the survey that was at all triggered or anything like that from the survey. And so that was huge in getting the survey through IRB, I think, is that I had thought about and had protection afterwards for debriefing with a trained psychologist within the facility that I was doing the study. And so IRB didn't ask a ton of questions about that. I have an IRB right now, though, that's not as easy because it is only about suicide of people who are incarcerated and are assessing suicide. And it's looking at assessing theories of suicide. So from mainstream kind of suicidology literature, I'm trying to test them in a jail. That is proving to be much more difficult. And so what I'm actually doing is bringing on a certified CBT SP, so someone who's certified in cognitive behavioral therapy suicide prevention, to handle and provide some aftercare for individuals who participate in the survey, which I'm hoping will push it through IRB. But yes, part of my IRB maneuvering has been to, I'm not hiding that they're on there, but I'm not, throwing it in their face that it's on there, if you will.
Yeah.
And I will.
Were there other questions you wanted to answer?
Ryan had a DBT question.
So DBT is like one of the promising practices. And this is something that my dissertation touches on in like kind of, my discussion chapter and like my policy chapter. DBT is something that I think would be hugely beneficial to people who are incarcerated. However, to my knowledge, that it hasn't been used in jails yet. I believe it has been used a couple of times in prison literature as prevention methods. But I think it would be something that would be beneficial because you can do it in jail short term. It doesn't have to be longer than, say, 3 months. And so since we know that jails are shorter term, that's part of the problem with prevention and treatment, is that people aren't in them for long enough to go and follow through with treatment or prevention programs. And so that's why I think transitional care is so important. But DBT is one of the ones that you could do for a shorter period of time. So I think it's something that is definitely, or should be looked at, hopefully will be looked at if I can get a grant.
I'm just interested in, like, is there such a thing as voluntary treatment in jails?
Yes and no. Primarily for like drug and alcohol, there is voluntary treatment. So people can self-identify and then attend, like AA, NA type programs.
Okay.
There's not a ton. So people can't self-identify as having suicidal behaviors or suicidality, but they're typically a lot of people under-identify because of the implications that what's going to happen is they're going to be thrown into, a solitary cell.
Right. They don't get to choose what kind of interventions they get.
No. I think if there was an ability to choose some interventions, it would be much higher percentage of people who would actually self-identify.
Yeah, I would imagine.
And also the questions that are typically used right now are like, at best, like 3 or 4 questions to ask people about their, suicidality. At minimum, it's like 1. And the worst is just no question at all. And typically those are all done at intake. So right when someone comes into the jail, which, I mean, we all know suicidality is dynamic. It's changing. It's not, you can come in and say no and it could change. And or you could come in and say yes and it could change, right? So it works in all directions. And I think that's one of the huge issues is that the testing and the ongoing assessment is just not there. It's very lacking.
Yeah. Are we ready for a little bit of Beef Corner?
Beef Corner. I'm going to make a new theme song for it.
Sing it, girl.
That was it. It was a one-time show.
Oh, well, you gotta make it match the video.
I just hate this video so much. It's so gross.
It's so gross.
I know we have to do it every time for Des, but
I mean, I guess
really
I could come up with something else, but I also kind of like how much it grosses you out. So
you don't miss Bitch I'm a Cow? Like, I showed it to you.
Her. She's on my other computer.
Doja Cat. Okay. Well, Beef Corner. Now I'm ready for it because I certainly have beefs with this video. My beef for the week is that when I try to have conversations with people about like not calling 911 and when people are having a mental health crisis, their response is always to be like, what could I do instead? And so we were actually just talking right before this about making like a list of 150 or something, some ludicrous number of like other things you could do, that it could include anything from like tying your shoes to like looking at clouds, take your dog for a walk, brush your hair. You could do literally anything else, and it might be better than calling 911 for a mental health crisis. So I'm probably going to make a very sarcastic document about that if anyone would like to contribute, because the last thing I ever want to do is let a beef go. Anybody else got beefs today?
I got beef.
Go for it.
I'm prepared. My beef is a grant reviewer denying my grant because they said suicide shouldn't be looked at because we shouldn't care about dead people.
Whoa, what?
Who says that? Who says that?
Yeah.
So luckily it was a small grant. I'm going to apply to other bigger grants, but we should care about people who die, and we should care about preventing it. So that's why we should care and fund research for this.
Yeah. Okay.
So that's
I have
my
a friend
beef because that just happened 2 days ago, and I've been holding on to it. Like,
it's a great beef. I have a friend who says like a lot that everyone's a secret asshole, but I don't even think people are secret assholes. It's just assholes everywhere.
It's just, I mean, it was a blind reviewer, so I don't know who it was, but I did email the organization and was like, this is unacceptable. I don't care that I didn't get the grant, but this is unacceptable. Like, this language and this.
Wow, that's kind of worse than the 911 thing, I think. Like,
they're
what?
Both bad.
Yeah, assholes everywhere.
Assholes everywhere.
Yep. Des, you got any beefs about assholes?
Of course I do. Of course I fucking do. Number one, the thing I was mad about most recently, and I'm like really mad today. Like, I'm so mad I need a Klonopin. That's really mad. That's like a 9. Like, I'm pissed.
Yeah. Like murder 9 or like lower than that?
I don't know if I could do murder. Like, I talk a big game, but I don't think I could do murder.
Like, want to do a murder but can't do it.
Yeah. I don't think I could kill someone in self-defense. Like, yeah, I'd like to think I could, but I don't think I could.
Yeah,
I like to think about murder.
Dead.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, anyway, go on. Who do you want to kill? You could say it differently. I'm just kidding.
Yeah, I don't actually want to kill. Like, the most recent one, it's just like, so there was the announcement of another suicide conference, like an online suicide conference. And there's some organizations partnering, and I'm looking at the fucking lineup, and it's like white person. I'm scrolling, and it's all fucking white people. And that's
the same ones, right? The same white people that presented every fucking thing.
Yes, the same white people I love and respect so much, but like, what the fuck? And then the last person is a Black woman, and I'm like, I have so many issues here.
Let's get some other voices.
Where no one with lived experience, no homos, like no one with any kind of differences of any kind, and then we put the one fucking token Black woman at the bottom.
I haven't looked at this yet because I saw all the messages about it, and then I was like, I can't yet.
You're gonna be mad, and obviously I have 10 ideas for how I can yell about it more loudly.
Maybe we should just on the same day host a free online series of Zoom sessions with people with lived experience presenting.
Maybe. Something.
Yeah. Okay.
I
Boo. I don't like that.
And I was thinking about it, and you know, something that you and Leia taught me is that when you guys are asked to speak, you say, "Where are your people of color?" I'm not doing this unless there are people of color. And I feel like the people who are involved in this are all people in positions where they have enough power that they could also make those demands. And so I'm having issues with that.
Yeah.
And then, man, I don't know. Like, my other beef is that Philadelphia is fucking something right now. Philadelphia has gone wild. I mean, we're always pretty. Anyway.
Like spring break, like flashing boobies wild, or
no, more like
less fun.
White men with bats wild.
Yeah, that's not my kind of wild.
No, it's not great. My neighborhood specifically, I was telling you guys before we got on here, but for people who don't know about Fishtown, it is actually a place. It's not just where I, you know, say all my pictures are from. It's the neighborhood I live in. And it's historically it's a fishing village, and it was more of a working neighborhood, working families neighborhood, and then it got gentrified. So I like gentrifying white people better than I like gentrifying black people. If we're being real, like I take a little bit of, feels a little better to me.
You would rather be a gentrifier in a white neighborhood than go into a black neighborhood and gentrify it? Yeah.
Yes, like I did that enough in New York. Didn't feel great. This is a little better.
Yeah.
Anyway, there are lots of clashes between the new and the old, and when the Black Lives Matter protests were really going hard here, and when we had curfew, there was a group of like 60 white guys with bats who walked around saying they were protecting our neighborhood. They actually beat the shit out of a journalist. They like spit on some girl. It wasn't good. They were out past curfew. The cops were taking pictures with them and like cheering them on. And so the neighborhood.
Sorry, I had a reaction.
You know, it's all a reaction that I feel about it. I mean, I'm ready to leave, but it's kind of like, you know, obviously pit people against each other in the neighborhood. Anyway, there was some yelling about it on my street earlier, and one of my neighbors came out with a bat, and I'm pretty fucking upset about it. I feel a little unsafe. It's not good. So I have beef with that.
Yeah, that's gross. Those are good beefs, everybody.
Yay! A+ beefs.
A+ beefs. Anyway, yeah.
FDA would give us an A.
Grade A beef.
Grade A beef.
Solid beef.
All right. So let's move on
to
beef
other
corner. Things. Well, yeah, we'll be done with beef corner, but move on to other beefy content. Because pretty much all of this is beef corner, I think.
Oh wait, I gotta get rid of my banner, I guess.
Yeah, households everywhere. I'm ready for more hot takes. So let's talk about how we manage reentry and continuing care.
Yeah, so this is actually another I just am overloaded with projects right now is honestly what it is. This is another project I'm working on with kind of doing some mapping of people who are incarcerated in jails and mapping them back into the community and seeing where transitional care lies. So there's more to the project. Some of it's also about employment and education and stuff like that. But looking to see if individuals who have reported themselves, self-reported as being at risk, where they're able to access transitional care. Because currently transitional care is just super lacking. For real, Ryan, I agree. Project overload is just way too common. And so what I'm actually doing is doing kind of a mixed method / mixed media approach to this, where I'm talking to people, interviewing them, and then also photographing them while they're incarcerated, and then bringing that back into the community, and photographing them when they are released and where they're able to obtain care, in order to show the community, in hopefully what the goal plan is to do like a gallery show of this, where I can literally map pictures and show individuals before they were incarcerated, during their incarceration, and when they come back to the community, and the lack of care, which is really what's showing, that's being given and supported to individuals who are coming back. But yet the community expects them to return and be, completely whatever functioning. I don't know what, I hate that word, because what is functioning? What is, contributing to society in an appropriate way? There's really no good measure of that.
I'm not doing that most of the
Functioning.
time. Functioning, yeah. Like my brain's just like, bleh, like shut down. Yeah.
But then they want to complain that people are recidivating, but we're not providing services or care that needs to be there. So it's a huge concern. I think it's something that often gets overlooked, not with just my research, but with a lot of research is, yes, we care about people while they're incarcerated. We do have a ton of information or new information on reentry, but we don't have the same information on transitional or continued care. As far as mental health, physical health is a huge one. When people are released, if they were, say, on a medication while they were incarcerated, how do they continue to get access to that medication? How do they continue to pay for that medication? Things like that we have very little knowledge of. There's some up-and-coming health criminologists that are looking at it, but it's just very, very under-assessed. And I think a lot of the thought process is that once people are released, they're not our problem anymore. And that's just simply not the case. I mean, simply put, it's just not.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. They're like, you're released and now you're perfect. And when you come back, that's on you. And it's like, no, it's kind of on the correctional system, because we didn't put any transitional care into place. And so how can we expect people to succeed, whatever that term means, beyond just recidivating, beyond just reoffending? Like, to me, success needs to be more than that. It needs to be more than just you didn't commit another crime. It needs to be you're healthy, you're happy, you're able to do and it's just it's just really frustrating.
Yeah, no shortage of fuckery.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm interested in your perspective on decarceration and abolition strategies and how they might connect with suicide in incarcerated populations. Well, they wouldn't be incarcerated, but yeah.
So I think a huge thing that's been a problem is I think that like defunding mental health facilities in the type of way that mental health facilities were at the time was good. Like the way mental health facilities were running in the late 60s, early 70s was not ideal. They were pretty tragic and pretty horrible and did a ton of long-term damage. And I think a lot of inpatient facilities now do this as well. I've spent time in an inpatient facility, so I kind of understand some of this. Hello, that was my lived experience, aftermath. But I think that there needs to be some other way to care for people, humans, in our society, in all societies, that is not a lock them away into a facility and either drug them up so much that no one can ever get out or be functioning again. And we can't just throw people into jail and say, no, you're part of our criminal justice system now, which is what we love to do. Because when mental health facilities got defunded and basically ended, jails, particularly not prisons, jails became de facto mental health facilities.
Yeah.
That is where everyone with mental health illness, serious, non-serious, whatever, they end up in jails if they don't have access to care. And we need to provide better access to care for people before it gets to a point that we're saying the best we can do for you is throw you in jail. Like,
right.
That's not the best we can do for you. Supposedly we're like this great country, but
we don't have great evidence of that at the moment.
Not for a while. Yeah, so I think that like I understand, and I think it's problematic to say that we should completely do away with all incarceration. And I say that very very heavily, actually. Like it sucks to say that, but I don't think we can realistically in our society, in our nation, completely get away with abolishing incarceration. It's just not realistic. And I think that when we deal with all these idealistic ideas of saying, like, let's completely get rid of something, we have a lot of problems because it's an absolute, right? It's an all or nothing thing. What I think a better option is to say, why do we have the incarceration problem that we have? Why do we have mass incarceration? Why are there 11 million plus people annually cycling through our jail system? That's massive.
Yeah.
Why do we have 11 million people annually cycling through? And what can we do to reduce that and to help in other ways? So I think taking more of kind of the actual what our correctional system is supposed to be, correcting people, rehabilitation, which is just not really happening right now. What can we do to kind of use more social working background in order to help people, as opposed to just doing this like punitive, bye type of thing?
So if we were going to look at some decarceration, not like total abolition, but if we were going to look at some decarceration strategies, where would you start?
I mean, I would start with identifying mental illness. I would start with identifying proper treatment protocol and prevention protocol. I would start with having some more community-based community centers for people before they enter the system, like access to, free or very inexpensive healthcare and mental health services included in healthcare, not just physical healthcare. I think that's something that's super lacking. It's something that has been done in the past and was very supported with research evidence as working, was having community type centers that offered services to people that were beyond just, after school programming or things like that offered like mental health services in a very either free or affordable way. And I think we need to have these in communities that are disadvantaged. I think that our disadvantaged communities are neglected massively. And it simply is not fair to expect individuals to be able to afford and seek help and treatment. And then I think the other thing is to low-level offenses. Like, there's so many other ways to deal with low-level offenses than putting people in incarceration, in facilities. So a great example in Florida, when I collected my data, which is what I used for my dissertation at a jail in Florida, there were people there who were spending their 7th month incarcerated in jail because they drove on a suspended license. And they couldn't get released, even though they could afford to pay the fees and leave. They couldn't get released because they couldn't get an ID, and they had to have a valid driver's license before they could be released, but they couldn't get access to get an ID before. So they were just basically in this holding pattern. And so I think things like that, like, we need to reevaluate, like, why are we locking people up? Why are we throwing people into jail and prison when there's a lot of other ways to handle situations like low-level driving offenses, low-level drug use? It's just kind of ridiculous.
Yeah.
Same with juveniles. I don't study juveniles, but juveniles, it's another way that we could reduce some of our incarceration uses. We don't need to throw kids into juvie centers because they were truant at school, or because they're not doing their online homework right now. I saw something about that today. Like, a student was put into a juvenile facility because they weren't doing their online classwork. Why are we putting kids into facilities? It's just crazy.
Yeah. I think there's so many great decarceration strategies, which that start with keeping people out of system contact, because it's so hard, given the way our system is structured, for people, once they've had the contact, you're fucked, right? You're gonna have more contact for the rest of your life. So and what the level of what that looks like, it depends on a lot of social factors for you, right? But if we can decriminalize certain things and divest policing and mental health services, and divest incarceration and mental health services, a ton of those things can make a really huge difference in I think specifically in jail populations, which is where most of the people are having their contact, right?
For sure. It's the majority of our incarcerated population is jails, and the least amount of programming or funding. I mean, what's even taught beyond mental health, the programming for education, vocation, all of that is very underfunded at the jail level. So it all needs to be reevaluated. And to touch, Abby asked a question about GED prep in a halfway house. Can I share my thoughts on transitional programs within the lens of decarceration? Yeah, so I think that transitional programs would help to kind of lower at least the length of time people would be incarcerated, which would be a start to decarceration. I think that, it's really hard to pass policy to say we don't need to have low-level offenders in. But if we can say, okay, we'll have low-level offenders, they can be incarcerated, but they're in there for like 2 weeks max, which would be like a maximum. And instead, let's now provide them, instead of paying all this money to incarcerate them, because it is expensive as hell to incarcerate an individual, instead of paying all this money to incarcerate them for a longer term, let's provide some transitional programs. So things that we know help keep people from returning to incarceration are things like a GED program, which sounds like you work with one, which is awesome. Things like a GED program, things like vocational training, things like securing housing, something that seems so basic is a huge factor in why people return, because they simply can't find housing that they can stay at. All of these are transitional programs that could work where they line it up while they're incarcerated. And then the individual, as part of the requirement of their sentence, they have to attend the transitional program. But once they do, we can either maybe scrub their records, things like that. Like there's ways to do it in order to impact lowering incarceration rates while still kind of in this like in-between stage. That's a really good question, though. I like that.
Yeah. Do we have any other questions right now before I start asking more of my questions? I always have more.
I think so.
Okay, great.
I'm kind of on top of them.
Cool. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't passing anyone up. So we talked a little bit about decarceration and abolition. I'm interested also in just some of the like racial factors that are going to come into play with just incarceration in general and specifically around suicide. I think we know that people of color are incarcerated more often, so that's exposing them to more risk. It's not just like across the board having any kind of incarceration. It's also they're more likely to be incarcerated multiple times, right? Mm-hmm. So how does that factor into suicide risk, or do we have good data about that, or do we have good guesses about it? Because I bet we have guesses if there's not data.
Yeah, so there is a little bit. Most of like the prison literature is done primarily on men because getting into men facilities for prison is so much easier. A lot of it's on males. A lot of it finds, disproportionate rates of suicide occurs, typically with Black people being more likely to be at risk for suicidality than white people. However, a lot of that depends on the proportion of the facility population. So let's say the facility population has a higher proportion of Black individuals incarcerated, their risk for suicide individually goes down. Black people. So the majority racial population has an impact on the individual suicide rates for within the facility. I didn't explain that super well, but so for example, if a jail has a higher proportion of white individuals incarcerated, a Black person incarcerated, suicide risk goes way up. Does that make?
Yeah,
are we?
Okay. That totally makes sense.
So there's a ton of stuff done. Another thing that hasn't super been looked at is this in terms of racism, which obviously, so we use race as an indicator, and it's something that I've totally been guilty of in the past. But really, we shouldn't be using it as a race variable. We should be using it as a racism variable. Because we're talking about when we have a huge percentage of a white population, it increases the risk for people who are Black or of color. So that includes Hispanic. We have horrible demographic variables in jails, FYI. Just like, we give 3 categories and that's it. And it's like, yeah, there's more than 3 categories. But we see, it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
But what really is at play then is it's a proportion thing, but I think what it underlying is a racism thing, is that when there are more white individuals incarcerated in a facility, Black people are targeted and thus likely impacts their mental health, which leads to an increase in suicidal behaviors. Yeah. That's really what I think is the underlying issue. I don't have the proper data to analyze that, but that's kind of what I think is happening. I also think that this is something that hasn't been looked at very much, but is related to all this, is a cultural component. It's definitely been looked at in general literature on suicide, but not in incarceration. But there's a huge cultural aspect to kind of, I want to say the stigma, but that's not really the right word that I want to use for it. But I'm going to say that because I can't think of the right word right now. But the stigma attached to individuals admitting or self-reporting that they have suicidality. And I think that's a huge racial and ethnic cultural thing that's at play. And so I think that's something that really needs to be looked at and analyzed, and different prevention methods presented for different types of culture. Because I think that different cultures need different prevention methods. For example, someone who is Muslim is going to need different prevention than someone who is Catholic. And I'm using religion because it's an easy cultural aptitude, but those are going to be different prevention methods because they have different cultural values, beliefs, moral system, all of that set up. And it hasn't really been used or analyzed in incarcerated populations.
So you're saying that we can't just create one size fits all strategies for suicide prevention and have them work in jails?
Sure not.
Shocking. It's almost like that's true everywhere.
Yeah, for sure. And to touch on Ryan's question about suicide risk for LGBTQ plus IA plus and people of color, it basically multiplies your risk. So it's something, again, that hasn't been super looked at for incarcerated populations. To the best of my knowledge, I think there's 2 studies that have questions about any sort of LGBTQ community. So my surveys have questions about sexuality and gender identity. So I asked 2 separate questions because they are 2 separate things, and I'm looking at it, but in my brief analysis, 30% of my sample identifies as someone who is not cis, which is very interesting, a much larger percentage than I was expecting. And it has high implications, especially when added or multiplied into someone being a minority, whether that's a minority as their sex identity or it's a minority as their racial or ethnic identity. Both impact their suicide risk status.
Wow.
Coming to a journal near you soon, hopefully.
Yeah. So we have talked about a lot of fuckery. What can people, like, are there things that people can do? Because it seems like right now there's a lot of general movement around and discussions about policing, incarceration, people of color. So are there things that we can do in the places that we live to like push on some of these things? Are there things we should be asking our legislators? Are there things that we should be asking in our communities or talking about? Like, is there something we can do about any of this?
There is. I mean, directly, maybe not, but there are things you can do indirectly, including voting for people in power, because a lot of, especially jail funding, comes from local funding, not from federal funding. So voting people into positions that align with things that you want, reaching out to people who are running in elections and asking them how they stand on these sort of topics and platforms. I have a form email if anybody wants one. I can send it to Jess and Des as well so that they can post it if they want to. A form email to send to people to ask about policies for suicide prevention within facilities and treatment programs. So that's something that you can do. You can attend town hall meetings, which talk about how local funding is going to be distributed. And I think the largest thing is to be vocal and talk about the fact that these are disproportionately affecting people who are in minority categories. And I think that we need to have larger discussions about this, because suicide doesn't just impact white people, which is what the media typically reports, right? I mean, it's very rare to see someone in the media or in mainstream news who is a person of color or who is LGBTQA when it's not attached to some sort of stigmatized language. So when it's not attached to some sort of like a trans life was a trans person committed suicide or something like that. We need to take away those, what are they, like, kind of qualifications. Like, a suicide is a suicide. It shouldn't matter who it's impacting. And so we need to kind of talk about that a little bit more, I think.
Yeah, I think sometimes that's complicated because we can erase people's identities that way too. So it's like a couple of things have to happen at once, right? We have to get to a place where like we are more respectful of identity, but also that we can think about suicide of like any person, regardless of their identity, that their experience with suicide is something that's worthy of like dignity and care.
Totally. And I think, I mean, maybe I didn't say that in the best way, but I don't mean to erase the identity at all. Sure. I mean, like, we see Jeffrey Epstein, again, I'm going to go back to him, when he died by suicide or conspiracy, but I mean, again, I really don't want to get into why I think he actually committed suicide, but whatever. But that was like plastered all over the news and media. But we have people who are minorities in whether their sexual or gender orientation or their ethnicity and race. And we don't see the same sort of respect given to those lives. That's what I really meant.
I agree.
Yeah. And we need to see the same respect given to those lives. And it's ridiculous that we don't, we shouldn't just care when it's someone that we have a conspiracy theory against that's this big, rich name. We should care for all people.
Yeah.
So that's more what I meant. Sorry, I don't think I said that very well.
No, that's okay.
I appreciate you calling me on that.
We also don't have to agree with each other too. Like if we have, I don't think we did there, but if we did, it's okay for people to disagree. So, okay, this was awesome. Thank you so much. I really think this was great timing. Yeah. Yep, we have our next episode. We have your fat friend coming back on, which we're really excited about. And we hope to see you all there on the 28th. Thanks, Frances. If people want to get in touch, your Twitter handle is right on here. Is that a good way?
Yeah, my Twitter handle has my website, which has my email and everything. So
perfect. Yeah, so you can find her on the grid.
On the grid.
All right.
Awesome.
Thanks for talking to us.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me. I'm so glad we finally made it happen.
Seriously, this was awesome.
Yeah.
All right. I'm ending the broadcast.
All right.
Maybe we'll know if it's over. Let's see.
Sometimes we know.